She was just 16 years old when it started. Her uncle David, the man her family trusted, the man who was supposed to protect her, he began sexually abusing Rachel Morrison in 2014. For 9 years, he raped her, manipulated her, threatened her into silence. When she finally found the courage to go to the police in 2024, they told her they couldn't prosecute. Not enough evidence. Too much time had passed. So on February 8, 2024, Rachel Morrison walked into her uncle's apartment and shot him 3 times. Then she called 911. She was arrested, charged with first-degree murder, facing life in prison. But when the jury heard her story, 9 years of abuse, a system that failed her, and a survivor who felt she had no other choice, they deliberated for 4 days and came back with a verdict that shocked the nation. This is the story of Rachel Morrison, a story of survival, of justice, and of a broken system that forces victims to become their own protectors. Before we dive into this incredibly difficult case, make sure you hit that subscribe button and comment down below what state you're watching from. This is a story that needs to be heard, and we need your support to keep telling these important stories. Now, let's uncover the truth about Rachel Morrison. Portland, Oregon, 2014. Rachel Morrison was 16 years old, a sophomore in high school. She lived with her mother, Karen, and her younger sister, Emily, who was 12. Rachel's father had died in a car accident when she was 8 years old, so it was just the 3 of them, making it work, getting by. Karen worked 2 jobs. She was a waitress during the day, cleaned office buildings at night. She did whatever she could to keep a roof over their heads, to put food on the table. But it meant she wasn't home much. The girls were alone a lot. That's where Uncle David came in. David Morrison was Karen's younger brother, 41 years old, never married, no kids. He lived alone in a small apartment about 20 minutes away. He'd always been close to the family, always offering to help out. When Karen needed someone to watch the girls while she worked her night shifts, David volunteered. He'd come over to the house, make sure Rachel and Emily did their homework, make them dinner, keep them safe. Karen was grateful. David was family. She trusted him completely. Rachel did too. At first, David was funny. He made the girls laugh. He brought them McDonald's, let them stay up late watching movies. He seemed like the cool uncle, the fun uncle, the uncle who actually cared. But then, things changed. It started small. David would sit too close to Rachel on the couch, put his hand on her knee, tell her she was pretty, tell her she was special. Rachel felt uncomfortable, but she didn't say anything. He was her uncle. Maybe she was just being paranoid. Then one night, when Emily was already asleep upstairs, David touched Rachel inappropriately. She froze. She didn't know what to do. She told him to stop. He did. For that night. But he came back the next week, and the week after that. And each time, it got worse. By the time Rachel was 17, David was raping her regularly, every time he came to watch the girls, every time Karen worked the night shift. Rachel tried to fight back at first, but David was 6'2", over 200 pounds. She was a teenage girl. She couldn't stop him. And then, David started threatening her. "If you tell anyone," he said, "I'll hurt your little sister. I'll tell your mom you came on to me. No one will believe you. You'll destroy this family." Rachel believed him. She stayed silent, and the abuse continued. For years, Rachel graduated high school in 2016. She tried to move out, get away, but she couldn't afford it. She was working part-time at a grocery store, barely making minimum wage. She had nowhere to go. David knew this. He used it against her. "You think you can just leave?" he'd say. "Where are you going to go? You need your family. You need me." So Rachel stayed, and David kept coming around, kept abusing her. She felt trapped, powerless, like there was no way out. Rachel tried telling her mom once, in 2017. She didn't give all the details. She just said David made her uncomfortable, that she didn't want him coming over anymore. But Karen didn't understand. "David's been so good to us," Karen said. "He helps out when I need him. What did he do that made you uncomfortable?" Rachel couldn't say it. The words wouldn't come out. She was too ashamed, too afraid. So she dropped it, and Karen kept inviting David over. The abuse continued through 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023, 9 years. Rachel was 25 years old, and David was still raping her, still threatening her, still controlling her life. Rachel fell into a deep depression. She started drinking heavily. She couldn't hold down a job. She had panic attacks, nightmares. She thought about suicide almost every day. Her sister Emily had moved out by then, gone to college in California. She'd escaped. But Rachel was still stuck, still trapped in this nightmare. And then, in January of 2024, something inside Rachel changed. She'd been watching a documentary about sexual abuse survivors, about women who'd been abused for years, who'd finally found the courage to speak up, to report their abusers, to get justice. Rachel thought, maybe she could do that too. Maybe she could finally tell someone. Maybe someone would finally believe her. On January 15th, 2024, Rachel walked into the Portland Police Department. She asked to speak to someone about a sexual assault. An officer took her to a small room, and Rachel told her story, everything. 9 years of abuse, starting when she was 16, her uncle, David Morrison, still happening, even now. The officer listened, took notes, asked questions, and then she delivered the news that would shatter Rachel's world. "I'm so sorry," the officer said. "But the statute of limitations for most of these incidents has expired. The abuse started in 2014. That's 10 years ago. Oregon law only allows prosecution for certain sexual abuse cases within a specific time frame. And because you were 16 when it started, not younger, and because so much time has passed, we can't build a prosecutable case." Rachel felt like she'd been punched in the gut. "What do you mean you can't prosecute him? He raped me. For 9 years. He's still doing it," the officer explained. There was no physical evidence, no witnesses. It was her word against his, and with so much time having passed, it would be nearly impossible to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. "But I'm telling you what happened," Rachel said. "Isn't that enough?" It wasn't. The officer told Rachel she could try getting a restraining order. She could try contacting a prosecutor directly. But the chances of David Morrison ever facing criminal charges were slim to none. Rachel left the police station feeling more hopeless than ever. She'd finally found the courage to speak up, and the system had failed her. Again, for the next 3 weeks. Rachel spiraled. She drank more, slept less, stopped eating. She kept thinking about what the officer had said. No justice, no consequences. David would get away with everything he'd done to her. And then, on February 7th, 2024, David texted Rachel, "Coming by tomorrow night. Your mom asked me to check on you." Rachel stared at that text for hours. David was coming back, to her apartment, like nothing had changed, like he still had control over her. And that's when Rachel made a decision. If the legal system wouldn't protect her, she'd protect herself. February 8th, 2024, 7 p.m. Rachel was waiting when David arrived at her apartment. She'd been waiting all day. She'd barely moved from the couch. She had a gun, a 9mm handgun she'd purchased legally 3 days earlier, after passing a background check. David knocked on the door. Rachel let him in. He smiled at her. That same smile he'd been giving her for 9 years. The smile that made her skin crawl. "Hey, kiddo," David said. Your mom wanted me to check on you. She said you've been having a rough time. Rachel didn't respond. She just stared at him. David walked into the apartment, looked around. You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. Rachel reached behind the couch cushion, pulled out the gun, pointed it at David. David's smile disappeared. Rachel, what are you doing? Put that down. You raped me, Rachel said. Her voice was shaking, but she didn't lower the gun. For 9 years, you raped me. And you're never going to stop, are you? David put his hands up. Rachel, I don't know what you're talking about. Let's just calm down and don't lie to me, Rachel screamed. I went to the police. They said they can't do anything, that it's been too long, that there's no evidence, so you win, right? You get away with everything you did to me. David started backing toward the door. Rachel, please, let's talk about this. You're confused. You're upset. I would never. Rachel fired. The first shot hit David in the chest. He fell backward, gasping, blood spreading across his shirt. Rachel fired again. The second shot hit him in the stomach. David collapsed to the floor. He was choking, trying to speak, but no words came out. Rachel stood over him, tears streaming down her face. You don't get to hurt me anymore, she said, and then she fired a third time, directly into his head. David Morrison died instantly. Rachel dropped the gun, fell to her knees, and called 911. I just killed my uncle, Rachel told the dispatcher. Her voice was eerily calm. He's been raping me since I was 16. I shot him. I need you to send the police. The dispatcher kept Rachel on the line, asked if she was injured, if there was anyone else in the apartment. Rachel answered all the questions. She was cooperative, almost detached, like she was watching everything happen from outside her own body. Police arrived within 5 minutes. They found Rachel sitting on the floor next to David's body. The gun was on the coffee table. Rachel's hands were covered in blood. She didn't resist arrest. She put her hands behind her back, let them cuff her, and said only one thing as they led her out of the apartment. He raped me for 9 years, and no one would help me. Rachel Morrison was charged with first-degree murder, premeditated, intentional, no self-defense claim, because David hadn't been attacking her at the moment she shot him. He'd been trying to leave. The prosecution argued this was a clear-cut case. Rachel had purchased a gun 3 days before the murder. She'd waited for David to arrive. She'd shot him 3 times, once in the chest, once in the stomach, once in the head. Execution style. This wasn't self-defense. This was murder. But Rachel's defense attorney saw something different. She saw a survivor, a woman who'd been failed by everyone, her family, the police, the legal system. A woman who'd been abused for 9 years and felt she had no other choice. Rachel's attorney argued this was a case of psychological self-defense, that Rachel had been living in a constant state of fear, that David's continued presence in her life represented an ongoing threat, that the legal system's refusal to prosecute had left Rachel with no legal recourse, no protection, no way out. The defense team brought in psychologists, trauma experts. They testified about the long-term effects of sexual abuse, about PTSD, about dissociation, about how survivors can reach a breaking point where they feel violence is their only option for survival. They brought in evidence of Rachel's police report from January, proof that she'd tried to go through the proper channels, that she'd been turned away, that the system had failed her. They brought in medical records, therapy notes, evidence of Rachel's mental health struggles over the years, her depression, her anxiety, her suicide attempts, and they brought in Rachel herself to testify, to tell her story, in her own words. Rachel took the stand in June of 2024. The courtroom was packed. Media from across the country had descended on Portland. This case had become a national story, a conversation about justice, about the statute of limitations, about what happens when the legal system fails survivors. Rachel was asked to describe the abuse, every detail, Starting from when she was 16, she cried through most of her testimony, but she didn't hold back. She told the jury everything: the rape, the threats, the years of silence, the fear, the shame. She described going to the police in January, the hope she'd felt, and then the crushing disappointment when they told her nothing could be done. "I didn't want to kill him," Rachel said on the stand. "I wanted the legal system to hold him accountable. I wanted justice. But when they told me there was no justice for me, I realized I was on my own. I've always been on my own." The prosecutor cross-examined Rachel, asked why she didn't just cut David out of her life, get a restraining order, move away. Why did she have to kill him? Rachel's answer was simple: because he would never stop. A restraining order is just a piece of paper. He'd been threatening me for 9 years. He said if I ever told anyone, he'd hurt my sister. He'd destroy my family. He had all the power, and I had none. Until that night. The prosecution argued that Rachel had other options, that she could have moved to another city, changed her phone number, disappeared. That murder was not the answer, but the defense argued that Rachel had been psychologically imprisoned, that 9 years of abuse had destroyed her ability to see any other way out, that she'd tried the legal route, and when that failed, she felt she had no choice. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury heard testimony from over 30 witnesses. Rachel's mother, Karen, testified. She broke down on the stand, said she had no idea the abuse was happening, that she'd trusted her brother, that she'd failed her daughter. Rachel's sister, Emily, testified. She said she'd always thought David was weird, but she never knew about the abuse, never suspected. She wished Rachel had told her sooner. Friends testified, teachers, therapists, police officers, medical examiners. Everyone had a piece of Rachel's story. And then, it was time for closing arguments. The prosecution's closing argument was straightforward. Rachel Morrison committed premeditated murder. She bought a gun. She waited for her uncle. She shot him 3 times. She had other options. She chose murder. The law is clear. This is first-degree murder. The defense's closing argument was emotional. Rachel Morrison is a survivor. She was failed by her family, by the police, by the legal system. She lived in constant fear for 9 years. She tried to do the right thing. She went to the police. They turned her away. She felt she had no choice. This is not murder. This is survival. The jury deliberated for 4 days. 4 long days where Rachel sat in her cell, wondering if she'd spend the rest of her life in prison, wondering if anyone would understand, if anyone would see her as anything other than a murderer. On July 2nd, 2024, the jury came back with their verdict. The courtroom was silent. Rachel stood, her hands shaking, her attorney beside her. The judge asked the jury foreperson if they'd reached a verdict. "We have, Your Honor." "On the charge of first-degree murder, how do you find the defendant?" The foreperson took a breath. "We find the defendant not guilty." The courtroom erupted, people gasping, some cheering, some crying. Rachel collapsed. Her attorney caught her. Rachel was sobbing. She couldn't believe it. Not guilty. She was free. But the foreperson wasn't finished. The judge asked about the lesser charges. The prosecution had included second-degree murder and manslaughter as options. "On the charge of second-degree murder, how do you find the defendant?" "Not guilty." "On the charge of voluntary manslaughter, how do you find the defendant?" "Not guilty." Rachel Morrison was acquitted on all charges. The jury had found her not guilty, not because they didn't believe she killed David Morrison, but because they believed she'd been driven to it, that she'd had no other choice, that the system had failed her so completely, that she'd been forced to take justice into her own hands. After the verdict, several jurors spoke to the media. They said it was the hardest decision they'd ever had to make. They knew Rachel had killed David, but they also knew she'd been abused for 9 years, that she'd tried to get help, that no one had helped her. One juror said, We couldn't send her to prison. She'd already been in a prison for 9 years, a prison created by her uncle. If the legal system had done its job, David Morrison would be in jail, and Rachel wouldn't have felt she needed to kill him. This is on the system, not on her. The verdict sparked a national debate. Some people praised the jury, said they'd done the right thing, that Rachel was a victim who'd been pushed too far, that the statute of limitations laws need to be changed, that survivors deserve justice no matter how much time has passed. Others condemned the verdict, said it set a dangerous precedent, that vigilante justice can't be tolerated, that Rachel should have found another way. That murder is never the answer. Legal experts were divided. Some said the jury had essentially nullified the law, that they'd let their emotions override their legal obligation. Others said the jury had used their power appropriately, that juries exist to ensure justice. And sometimes, justice means looking beyond the letter of the law. The prosecution chose not to appeal. They said they respected the jury's decision, that the case had been tried fairly, that the jury had heard all the evidence and made their choice. Rachel Morrison walked out of that courtroom a free woman, but she was far from free. She'd killed her uncle. She'd taken a life. And even though the jury said it was justified, Rachel would have to live with that decision for the rest of her life. In the months after the trial, Rachel gave a single interview. She spoke to a national news program about her experience. She was asked if she regretted killing David. "Every day," Rachel said, "I wish I'd never had to make that choice. I wish the police had been able to help me. I wish my family had protected me. I wish David had never touched me in the first place. But I can't change any of that. All I can do is move forward and try to help other survivors who feel like they have nowhere to turn." Rachel became an advocate for changing statute of limitations laws for sexual abuse cases. She testified before the Oregon legislature, shared her story, pushed for reform. In 2025, Oregon passed Rachel's Law, a bill that eliminated the statute of limitations for all sexual abuse cases involving minors. No matter how much time passes, survivors can now seek justice. Rachel also started working with a nonprofit organization that helps sexual abuse survivors navigate the legal system. She speaks at schools, at conferences, at survivor support groups. She tells her story, not to glorify what she did, but to highlight the failures in the system, the gaps that leave survivors vulnerable. Rachel's mother, Karen, struggled after the trial. She blamed herself, said she should have seen the signs, should have protected her daughter. She and Rachel are slowly rebuilding their relationship. It's not easy. There's a lot of pain, a lot of broken trust, but they're trying. But Rachel's sister, Emily, has been supportive. She visits Rachel regularly. They talk on the phone every week. Emily wishes Rachel had told her about the abuse, but she understands why Rachel stayed silent for so long. As for David Morrison, his death divided his family. Some believed Rachel's story, some didn't. Some said David was a monster who got what he deserved. Others said Rachel was lying, that David would never have done those things, that Rachel killed an innocent man. David's mother, Rachel's grandmother, died 6 months after the trial. Some say it was from a broken heart. Others say it was from the shame. She'd defended David until the end, refused to believe her son could have done those things. Today, Rachel Morrison lives in Portland. She has a small apartment. She works for the nonprofit full-time. She's in therapy, still dealing with the trauma, still healing. She says she'll probably be healing for the rest of her life. She doesn't have a relationship with most of her extended family. They cut her off after the trial, said she'd destroyed the family, that she'd murdered their son, their brother, their uncle. They refused to believe the abuse happened. But Rachel has found a new family, among other survivors, other advocates, people who understand, people who believe her, people who know that sometimes survival looks ugly. Sometimes it looks violent. Sometimes it looks like justice, taken into your own hands. The Rachel Morrison case raises impossible questions, questions our legal system still struggles to answer. What do we do when the system fails survivors? What happens when the statute of limitations protects abusers instead of victims? What is justice when the law says there can be no prosecution? Psychologists say Rachel's case is unfortunately common. Many abuse survivors feel trapped, powerless, like they have no legal recourse, and some, like Rachel, reach a breaking point where violence feels like the only option. But experts also warn, Rachel's acquittal doesn't mean vigilante justice is acceptable. It doesn't mean survivors should take the law into their own hands. Rachel's case was unique. The jury believed her specific circumstances justified her actions. But that doesn't apply to every case. The legal community continues to debate the verdict. Some law professors use Rachel's case in their classes as an example of jury nullification, of how juries can refuse to convict even when the law technically requires it, of the power juries have to send a message about justice. Others use it as a cautionary tale, about the dangers of letting emotion override law, about the slippery slope of justifying murder under any circumstances. Advocacy groups have seized on Rachel's case to push for reform, not just in Oregon but across the country. Dozens of states are now considering eliminating or extending statutes of limitations for sexual abuse cases. Rachel's story has become a rallying cry, but critics worry about the implications. They say there's a reason statutes of limitations exist. That evidence degrades over time. Memories become unreliable. Witnesses die. Defendants have a right to a fair trial, and that becomes harder the more time passes. It's a complex issue, with no easy answers. Rachel Morrison's case highlighted these tensions in the starkest possible way. One thing is certain. Rachel Morrison's life will never be what it could have been. The abuse stole 9 years from her. The trial and its aftermath stole more. She'll always be known as the woman who killed her uncle, the woman who was acquitted of murder because a jury believed she'd had no choice. Rachel says she's at peace with the verdict, but she'll never be at peace with what happened, with what was done to her, with what she felt forced to do. "I didn't want to be a killer," Rachel said in her interview. "I wanted to be a survivor who got justice through the legal system. But when that wasn't possible, I became a different kind of survivor, one who had to create her own justice. I'll live with that for the rest of my life, and I really hope, that my case helps change things, so that other survivors don't have to make the choice I made." The Rachel Morrison case is a tragedy on every level. A young girl was abused for 9 years. The legal system failed her, she killed her abuser, and now she has to live with all of it. There are no winners here, only survivors. And the question of whether justice was truly served depends on who you ask. What do you think? Was the jury right to acquit Rachel Morrison? Or should she have been convicted of murder? Do you believe survivors should be able to take justice into their own hands when the legal system fails them? Or is there never a justification for murder? These are difficult questions without easy answers. But they're questions we need to be asking, as a society, as a legal system, as people who want justice for survivors. Comment down below and let us know what you think. And tell us what state you're watching from. We want to hear from you. This is a conversation that needs to happen. If Rachel's story affected you, if it made you think, if it made you feel something, hit that like button. Share this video. Subscribe to American Shadow for more true crime stories that matter, stories that challenge us, stories that force us to think about justice in new ways. And if you or someone you know is a survivor of sexual abuse, please reach out for help. The National Sexual Assault Hotline is available 24/7 at 1-800-656-HOPE. You're not alone. You deserve support. You deserve justice. Remember, justice isn't always found in a courtroom. Sometimes it's found in healing, in surviving, in speaking your truth. And sometimes, justice is complicated, messy, imperfect, but it's always worth fighting for. I'm American Shadow. Thank you for watching. Stay safe out there.